But first, let me show you the basic connections that exist here. Afferent signals are sent from the motor cortex to the striatum, which in turn sends signals to both the internal and external segments of the globus pallidus. From here, the motor loop splits into two pathways. The first is a direct pathway, which involves communication directly between the internal segment of the globus pallidus. And the second is an indirect pathway, which involves communication between the external segment of the globus pallidus and the subthalamic nucleus, which then loops back to the internal segment of the globus pallidus and thalamus. From here, the thalamus communicates back to the motor cortex, completing our loop. Let's take a closer look at each pathway to see what they're all about. So here we have a schematic of the direct pathway of the motor loop, in which we're using blue and red arrows to demonstrate connections between various structures. The blue arrows in the diagrams signify excitatory neurons, which stimulate their target structure and use the neurotransmitter glutamate. The red arrows represent the inhibitory neurons, which disable their target structure. The neurotransmitter associated with them is known as GABA for gamma-aminobutyric acid. So let's dive in and see what's happening here. As we can see, a signal is initiated in the motor cortex. This signal acts to stimulate the striatum, which, if you remember, is the collective name for the caudate nucleus and the putamen. When stimulated, the neurons of the striatum have an inhibitory effect on the internal globus pallidus and a part of the substantia nigra known as the pars reticulata, abbreviated as SNR on our diagram. Since we're talking about inhibition, it's the GABA neurotransmitter that is at work here. Now, the activity of the thalamus in a resting individual is normally inhibited by the internal globus pallidus and the substantia nigra pars reticulata. GABA, again, is the neurotransmitter here. When the activity of the internal globus pallidus is inhibited by the striatum, that removes its inhibitory influence over the thalamus. This process is known as the disinhibition of the thalamus. It allows the thalamus to fire stimulatory impulses at the motor cortex, which amplifies its activity. This eventually promotes muscle contractions that make you want to wave your arms about or swing your hips when you hear a good tune. The indirect pathway contains all the same elements as the direct pathway, with the addition of subthalamic nuclei. The aim of this pathway is the opposite of the direct pathway in that it inhibits the thalamus and prevents it from firing excitatory signals to the motor cortex. The indirect pathway starts with the motor cortex sending an afferent excitatory signal to the striatum. This time, however, the signal received from the motor cortex is from a different area than that involved in the direct pathway and carries directions for unwanted movements, which might compete with the desired movement resulting from the direct pathway. The putamen and the globus pallidus are somatotopically organised, meaning they have different regions related to different parts of the body. Therefore, they're able to facilitate signals related to arm movements via the direct pathway and simultaneous disfacilitation of unwanted leg movements via the indirect pathway. Pretty clever, right? For example, if you wanted to reach out to grab something with your hand, you don't want your legs to carry you away in the opposite direction. Your basal ganglia recognises this and inhibits this kind of action. So an inhibitory signal is sent to the external globus pallidus rather than the internal globus pallidus, like in the direct pathway. Again, the neurotransmitter in action is GABA. Instead of having a direct connection to the thalamus in a resting individual, the external globus pallidus sends a constant inhibitory signal to the subthalamic nucleus. When the external globus pallidus is inhibited by the striatum, its inhibitory effect on the subthalamic nucleus decreases. That causes the subthalamic nucleus to send an excitatory signal to the internal globus pallidus. As we know, the internal globus pallidus only has an inhibitory influence over the thalamus, which causes its inhibition. That means the thalamus is prevented from sending a signal to competing areas of the motor cortex, and voila, no competing movements are propagated. I want to mention another pathway, known as the nigrostriatal pathway, which plays an important role in modulation of both the direct and indirect pathways of the motor loop. This pathway projects from the substantia nigra pars compacta to the striatum, and it utilises the neurotransmitter dopamine. It affects the motor loop in two ways. It excites the direct pathway, and it inhibits the indirect pathway. The different effects of the direct and indirect pathway is explained by the activation of the different dopamine receptors that are located within the neurons of the striatum. There are two types of dopamine receptors, D1 and D2, which respond differently when stimulated with dopamine. Stimulation of D1 results in the excitation of the neuron, while the stimulation of D2 results in inhibition. D1 receptors are found in the striatal neurons that give rise to the direct pathway. On the other hand, D2 receptors are found on the neurons whose axons form the indirect pathway. So when dopamine is released from the substantia nigra pars compacta, it results in the promotion of the direct pathway and at the same time the inhibition of the indirect pathway. If you found this quick anatomy or physiology video helpful, you'll enjoy our video tutorials even more. Click on the button and you'll see what I mean. We have hundreds of videos available to our premium members, not to mention all the fun quizzes, complete articles, and atlas sections to solidify your knowledge. Click on the button in the middle to watch the full-length video and master anatomy and physiology.